My name's Jim Watson. I'm Director of the Institute for Sustainable Resources at UCL. We're really pleased to have Chris Stark with us this evening. Chris is the Chief Executive of the Committee on Climate Change. That's the official advisory body to the UK government on our carbon budgets, on our climate target, our net zero target, and providing lots and lots of advice and evidence on how we're doing on the way to get there and what more needs to be done. And there's certainly been more emphasis on the what more needs to be done in recent years. I've got Chris's bio in front of me. I'm not going to read it out to embarrass the poor man. But I would just say I first met Chris when he worked at the Scottish Government, where he headed up their Energy and Climate Change division, and I was Director of the UK Energy Research Centre, and it was a really productive time. Luckily for us, the Scottish Government was developing their own climate energy strategy, and we had a really good dialogue, and I think helped to shape, amongst many other people, that strategy, which really put transitions at the heart of what Scotland want to do, and now that's become very common in countries around the world. Chris is going to be leaving the Committee on Climate Change in a few months' time, so as he quipped to me earlier, this is part of a sort of farewell tour, but I'm sure he's going to give a talk which is just as interesting as ever. Chris is going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions after that, and then some drinks afterwards. So without further ado, I'd love to hand over to Chris, and please tell us what you've got to say.
Thank you, Jim. So thank you to Jim, and yes, Jim and I go back a while now, actually. So I'm in a sort of reflective mood now. So I've decided that it's time to move on from the Climate Change Committee, and I should probably address that now. So I'm not leaving in a huff. So that's the main thing I wanted to say. I'm mainly leaving because it's an amazing job, and you don't want to get stale in this job. I think it's really important that we have fresh eyes on this challenge. And although I think I do have some thoughts on what we could do differently next time, the other thing that you accumulate in this role is baggage. So there's a lot of baggage. And you may know I'm going to talk to you tonight mostly about net zero. Net zero has definitely been the theme of my time in the CCC. And amongst that work for net zero, we've done the advice for the 6th carbon budget, which is the latest of the targets that the UK set. And we're about to do the advice for the 7th. And it's more than anything, actually, that's what's made me think it's time to move on, because the question will be not what's in it, but why have you changed your mind? So I think someone else should have a free go at that. So this is a good thing, the Climate Change Committee. So we've had it in this country since 2008 under the legislation that is also a good thing, the Climate Change Act, that determines what the UK is doing about climate change. And I'm going to talk tonight about climate politics as much as I am about the technical story of what the UK needs to do to address climate change. And I think we're in we've been through several phases of climate politics since we've had the Climate Change Act back in 2008. And this organisation has successfully managed to ride its way through those various waves of really strong support for action on climate change, with periods of very strong concern about action on climate change. I don't know if we're in one of those right now. I'm kind of interested what you think about that. It certainly felt tougher in the last year or so than it has in the 5 years prior to that for me. But also, I think that's really why the Climate Change Committee is such a useful thing, because we're here at that point just to stick to the numbers, stick to your knitting, as we say in Scotland. So this is definitely a sort of stick to your knitting moment. So I'm going to talk about all of that tonight. But I'm going to just start with this chap. I said I was being reflective, so this might be a very long discussion. So we're back to 1859 with John Tyndall. Why am I showing you a picture of John Tyndall, apart from the fact it's a tremendously striking photo, and beards were definitely different in the 1850s. He's generally thought to be the sort of father of climate science. And I'm showing you this because you might notice that if he is the father of climate science, it's quite a long time ago that he fathered it. So we've known for a very, very long time the science of climate change. Tyndall was the one who was credited, he's an Irish academic, credited most, I suppose, with putting out there the science of it. He did some work looking at the properties of various gases and how much heat they trapped. This is the other photo. I like this one better. So this is Eunice Foote, and she's a sort of badass academic who doesn't get enough credit at all for doing very similar science, actually, 3 years prior to Tyndall. And slightly cruder experiment, but very similar. She was the one who first noted, actually, that carbon dioxide in particular had these properties that should concern us, given that we are burning lots of fossil fuels and creating carbon dioxide as we do so. And she spotted back in 1856 that that might have some impact on the climate, and Tyndall did very similar things. So this is not new. And I kind of wanted to make that point to start tonight, because I think occasionally we forget just how settled the science is. There's definitely some debate about some of this, but it's easy to be seduced by what you read on Twitter or X, whatever you call it. There is indeed debate about some of this, but there's not debate about the fundamentals. And the fundamentals are best described here. Now, in all of the charts that I have shown in my I am very reflective tonight. I'm sorry, I won't do that very much. But in all of the charts that I've used over the 6 years, this is definitely the one that I find has the biggest impact for those who are not working on climate change. So last week in Scotland, actually, around the Scottish Cabinet table, I was invited to speak to all of the Scottish political leaders about where we are on climate change, which is a great privilege to do that. And this was the chart. It got an audible gasp, actually, from some of the people around the table. So why is it so important? 800,000 years there, which we have a very good record of. So this is from samples of bubbles trapped in ice. So we've got this nearly million-year record now of the carbon dioxide concentration on the planet. It has this lovely cycle to it. We have other ways of looking at the temperature over similar periods. It looks exactly the same. And that's because there's a near linear relationship between the temperature on the planet and the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, there are other gases at play too, of course, as well. But this is the simplest way to demonstrate it. But this is the bit that got the gasp, right? So that's what we've done in the last 150 years, 200 years. And of course, that's the story of fossil fuels. And the point I wanted to make about this is, obviously, it's dramatic. I mean, you're seeing a dramatic shift. And we've been at these concentrations before as a planet, but not for a few million years. And it was a much warmer planet when we had these concentrations before. Sea level's probably 20 meters higher maybe than it is today when we were at these concentrations before. So that gives you a sense of how much change there is. But the point in this is that I don't want to be one of the people that says to you that this is unadulteratedly bad. This is, what that line represents is a story of enormous progress in the global economy. And you can see the story of what's happening in the global economy in that line. You can see how rapidly it's gone up over that period. And this is what's lifting people out of poverty and driving the global economy. And the challenge is not to stop doing that, I think. It's to change the basis of that. But we better get on with it, is the sort of message here, because we're well over 400 parts per million now, 425, I checked it today. And what that red box represents is 1.2 degrees centigrade of warming, which sadly is not it doesn't sound as big a number when you're presenting it to an audience that doesn't deal with climate change, but it's a hell of a big number when you think of planetary scale and how quickly it's happened. So I start with this because I think it's important that we keep returning to it. There's not really much to debate here, actually, and in climate politics, I sort of feel we debate things that are often at the margins, and that'll be a theme of the talk that I give you tonight as we go along. But we've got to keep coming back to the fundamentals, which are this. We do have a problem. I've put climate crisis with a question mark next to it, because a crisis is a loaded term, but I think it is a crisis, and that is how we should look at it. And the other part to this, again, 13 years now working on climate policy in total, is that we also forget to present why it's important to act on it. I mean, this is compelling enough for me at least, but another thing I've done recently, one of the things that I will always remember actually in this job is I did an all-staff event for the Ministry of Defence. And I thought, fair enough, I'll go and speak to the Ministry of Defence. That's 250,000 people. So they didn't all turn up. So that's a hell of a room. But basically, this was the one that they were most drawn into. And really interesting, this is work the Met Office did a few years back now. Just kind of portraying what a 4-degree world would look like. We'll talk in a minute about whether 4 degrees is the right temperature, but it's really interesting again, we should be doing more of this, I think, just presenting as clearly as we can why this is not a world we want to see. So I'm going to just show you a couple of takes on that. This is looking at what we call the wet bulb globe temperature, which is heat and humidity greater than 32 for more than 10 days per year. So this is, again, 4-degree world. Basically, you can't live for very long in this kind of conditions. You need to be in an air-conditioned building in these kind of temperatures. You can see the parts of the world that are affected by that there. This is drought, so extreme drought here, different parts of the world there. You can see, edging closer to us here, some really interesting stuff happening in South America as well. This is river flooding, so more than 1 million people affected by river flooding, which is one of the ones I think we should be thinking about more here, of course, as well. And wildfires, which to me is the one to watch, actually, because I think more than anything, this is one that's pricking the public consciousness now. So if you went on holiday to the continent last summer, you were probably near a wildfire at some point. If you went to North America, North Americans really saw this last year. This is very high wildfire risk, again, in that 4-degree world. And the other thing you can do, which the Met Office did very well, I think, is just bring that together in one single thing, just to say, what would that mean if you had multiple impacts happening at once? And I think this is quite a good way of portraying an unlivable world. This is going to be enormously difficult. Look at some of the parts there in Africa and South America, where you're seeing multiple impacts, multiple severity, real challenge. And I suppose the other thing you can say is that this coincides, sadly, very well with those areas of the world where we're presently seeing increasing populations. So if you want to see the migrant problem behind climate change, it's there on that map. And that's where a lot of the political difficulty comes from, of course, as well. Now, I'm showing you all this because I think it's good to start with a bit of a warning of why we should care about this. Now, in this room, I suspect you know all of this, but we don't, as a trade, those of us who work in climate change, do enough on communicating this with impact. And actually, I think this was a really good piece of work from the Met Office. Now, a 4-degree world is definitely not a world we want to get to, and happily, it's probably not the world that we're going to get to. And it's a fool's errand to predict anything, really, but given that we have known the science of climate change for so long, we can also say quite a lot about where we may end up, given where we are on emissions and the global trajectory for emissions. So this is a nice chart that we update fairly regularly now in the Climate Change Committee, looking at the global story. And this was the position actually pre-COP28. We'll be able to update this shortly, but this is a very important chart because you can probably see the history here on the left of historical global emissions, which are heading, of course, upwards and continue to head upwards. But you can also see the coloured lines on this chart with a little temperature at the end of them, which is the median of that particular pathway for emissions. And I think this is just a fact. We could spend an hour just looking at this and talking about it, and I won't. Jim will be glad to hear. But what was interesting about COP28 was that I think it was actually a very useful COP. Now, there's controversy always about every COP. But it was in a petrostate. It was in a place where they chose to host it, despite being an economy that is resting at present on fossil fuels. And of course, they need to talk about the transition. And this was a COP that really was framed by the transition away from fossil fuels. And the reason why we got some text that had that language in it is partly because of diplomacy on climate. And of course, that is a big feature of the story on climate in recent years, certainly since 1990. But mainly, it's because the underlying transition is now definitely underway. So we are definitely seeing the move from fossil fuels to cleaner energy systems. Around about the time I started this job, back in 2018, that was probably the time, nothing to do with me starting this job incidentally, but that was probably the time when spending on clean energy overtook spending on fossil fuels. So we're now seeing the benefit of that, I suppose you could say. Now, benefit's a word that we could talk about too, but more importantly, the IEA and others have said that we're now in what they call the plateau period for fossil fuel use, which means we'll get to a peak at some point for our use of fossil fuels, and with it, at some stage very close to it, the peak in emissions will come too. And that story's not told enough either. And that's why even states like the Saudis felt able to sign up to language like that, because it's actually happening. And they see that, and if you want evidence of that, you can just see, particularly from the petrostates, that the investment levels in new production for oil and gas are just much lower than they used to be because they're expecting to supply less. And I think what's interesting to me is if we are in the plateau phase, and I think we are, you never know when you're in a peak. So this could even be the year when we see peak. What's interesting is not this year, it's where we'll be shortly. And we'll talk about these temperatures in a second, but for me, what's really interesting is that this is when the big disruption's likely to happen. So as we move away from oil and gas, you're going to see some very odd things happen in the oil and gas sector itself. We're going to see consolidation. I suspect there will be a lot of consolidation. I actually have quite a lot of time for those oil and gas producers who are honest about where they think they're going to be. So you've got a few of them now saying they're going to be the last man standing. They are generally men, by the way, that say this. So they are, and that is an honest position. At least I get that. And it sort of frames, I suppose, that there is a challenge beyond that. And this is quite nice, actually, because if you look at that purple line at the top, which is we called existing policies, I think that's deeply conservative. And if you look at that, you'll see that that takes you to a temperature of 2.7 degrees centigrade. If I had presented to you before the Paris Agreement in 2015, I would have been talking about an existing policy line that was probably about 1 degree centigrade higher than that. So that gives you a sense that since 2015 to where we are today, we have successfully knocked off about 1 degree centigrade from that median pathway. Again, there's always debate about this. There's a far more complex version of this that shows you all the uncertainty that plays out over time. But I don't think we will be on that path, because I think when the transition takes hold, you'll get this exponential impact, which again, we'll talk about in a second. 2.7 degrees centigrade, before you get excited about it, is utterly catastrophic. So, it would be terrible for the planet. So it is not where we want to end up. Paris Agreement talks about keeping temperatures to well below 2. And if you look at that red line there, that has the NDCs, as they're known. That's the country pledges to the UN process for 2030. And it has the net zero targets in there that many countries have signed up to, including the UK. And if you believe that we'll deliver those things, which is a big if, because I don't believe that we will at the moment, that takes you to, in this pathway, at least 1.8. So there is a path to below 2. And those of you who were around at COP26 when the UK hosted the COP in my hometown in Glasgow, that was all about keeping 1.5 alive. That's what you need to believe if you want to keep 1.5 on the table. So it's alive, but it's mostly alive in a model. Sort of kicking, trying to get out. So that's the 1.5 degree pathway. And the reason that's so tough is because what matters to climate change is the area under the curve. It's not the destination, it's how quickly you bring it down. And 1.5 requires us to bring it down very, very quickly. And even a pandemic didn't really do that. So that requires deep, deep shifts in patterns of investment and shifts in the way that we use fossil fuels towards cleaner technologies very, very rapidly. I doubt that we will do that, let's put it that way. But I'm not willing to kill off that pathway just yet. I think 1.5 degrees is still a worthwhile thing to talk about. I mean, obviously, if it's not 1.5, we should be aiming for 1.6, and if it's not 1.6, 1.7. Every fraction matters here. But more than that, actually, it's still a useful way of, it's a sort of containment for throwing everything at it. And it's useful for us to look at it that way. And I think we should continue to look at it that way. Whether we keep calling it 1.5 degrees, that'll be another challenge, I'm sure, for the community that talks about these things. But other thing to say about this is, I am an optimist about the energy system shift particularly. But let's not forget that these are still catastrophic outcomes. So even 1.5 actually is going to be tricky. And 1.8, if we were to hit that kind of temperature, involves huge shifts, huge change in the climate and huge impacts with it. So the other big message on this chart is that we're going to have to adapt to this. So wherever we are on this, we have no option but to adapt to it. And I think I won't talk about so much of this tonight, although I'm very happy to take questions on it later. But I think the next frontier for those of us who work on this is to try and build in the adaptation story more effectively and integrate it properly into the story of also cutting emissions whilst adapting. So achieving net zero in a warming climate is what we've been talking about recently in the Climate Change Committee. And it's hard to do that because we don't have the ability to frame it in the same way, to build the same pathways that sit underneath that. And I think we should try. So that for me is really exciting. If I was hanging around at the CCC, that's what I would be pushing for. I think whoever replaces me, that will almost certainly be their mission. So that's a really interesting thing to do. Okay, let's get back to the UK. Let's talk about net zero. So when I started this gig, we had a target for 2050 that was not a net zero target. So we had a target for the country, it's the emissions territorially produced within our territorial borders, to hit 80% reduction by 2050 on a 1990 basis. And in the first year I was in the job, we were given the task of looking at the Paris targets and asked basically a pretty simple question. Are they right? Is that 80% target the right target? Is this the right framing for the UK's support of the Paris Agreement? And we concluded that it wasn't. So we did a lot of work to look at raising the ambition. And we concluded that net zero was the right ambition. Now, in this room, you know what net zero is, but it's basically a position where we're putting as much into the atmosphere as we're taking out. Having reduced our emissions as far as possible, whatever's left, we've got to net that off somehow. And that's the net bit, of course, in net zero. And what has been astonishing to me since we did that is the degree to which that's become as much a slogan as a scientific goal. But it is a scientific goal. And in particular, net zero CO2 is the scientific goal. So net zero CO2 is the point, science has firmed up really well on this, that's the point when we stop warming the planet. A global goal of net zero for carbon dioxide, we stop warming the planet. Until we do that, we keep warming the planet. So it's quite simple. And the UK's target is actually a basket of gases, including carbon dioxide, but including some of the other gases too. So if we achieve net zero, it's slightly harder than doing it for carbon dioxide alone. We'll actually achieve a very small cooling impact on the planet if we pull it off, which is good, I think. But I think more than all of that, the task here is not just to get to it, it's to demonstrate how to do it, because we're doing something very useful that goes beyond our borders if we do that. And I'll talk about that now. So here is where we are now on that UK territorial emissions basis. And there's quite a few things on this chart. I'm going to keep returning to the red line in this chart as I talk through it. So the story, you might have seen yesterday, UK ministers and others trumpeting the story that we've halved emissions since 1990. And you can see that on this chart. So in fact, emissions have been falling in the UK for quite a bit longer than that, since the 70s probably. I wish I knew what date they peaked, but that's the story of coal and some of the early heavy industry losses that we saw prior to 1990. But what's happened since 1990 is about a number of things. There's a bit of that deindustrialisation going on. There's not that much of it, actually. The GVA of manufacturing is more now than it was when we started the Climate Change Act in 2008. But very much a story of change in the power sector, particularly. And also a story of energy efficiency, which doesn't get enough attention, I think. Actually, a really important part of why we've been able to cut emissions is that we're just using energy much more efficiently. And some of that is to do with things like EU regulations. A lot of it, though, is to do with just the march of technology. So you don't have massive tellies and fridges any longer that soak up all that energy. We've got different ways of doing it. So that's the story here. You see the grey blocks on this chart. They're the carbon budgets under the Climate Change Act. And the really clever bit of the Climate Change Act was that it's not just a 2050 goal. It also correctly, I think, identified that government's not that good at sticking to long-term goals. Controversial. It also needs more of an incentive in the short term, and the carbon budgets are that incentive. So the legal target is actually one every 5 years. We now know what happens if government looks like it's not going to hit that. The courts are willing to act. We've actually had a successful legal challenge that has prompted the government to produce a different plan. So there's this piece of legislation that is doing something very clearly. It's the legal obligation of the government to hit the target, but they can do it in whatever way they see fit. And that's the kind of beauty of it, really. It's not me telling them how to do it, although I've got ideas. It's politics and policy, and that is quite rightly something that the government gets to decide. And there's lots of ways in which that might play out. And the story you see here is that the government has fairly comfortably actually met the first of the first three carbon budgets that were set. All of the blocks that you see on this chart were the product of advice from my organisation, the Climate Change Committee. The first three we set really not really knowing how things would play out. I'm going to be honest with you that. So we didn't know, for example, the impacts of the financial crisis on the economy. They're loose, basically. If we'd gone back in time, we probably would have advised a tighter set of targets, and we've outperformed them. And in a sense, it doesn't really matter. It's past history. What matters is what's coming next. And that was, I suppose, on one hand, yesterday's news confirmed yesterday that we've halved emissions is something really worth celebrating. Not every country in the world has done that. And the fact that we've met all the carbon budgets is also worth celebrating. But there's rather too much of a kind of retrospective look, I think, on this. I think the key thing is not what's happened in the past, it's whether you're on track for what comes next. And on that front, I will talk a lot about that tonight. It's just much harder. So the last half inevitably is harder than the first half. And you can probably see this one here, carbon budget 6. That was mine. Carbon budget 6 is quite a bit lower than the ones prior to that, which is not me saying that previous holders of this role got it wrong. It's mainly that that's the first carbon budget that was set since we reset the net zero goal in 2050. So it's the one that matters most here. It's the one that guides that path. Other thing just to say, since there's an audience that will probably appreciate it, international aviation and shipping emissions not in the Act, not in the carbon budgets, although government promises they will be in from CB6. So at the moment they're not, but we've always tracked with international aviation and shipping in there. So I actually feel we should be happy to celebrate this. I think the more that we bring some positivity to this, the better. Could we have done more? Absolutely. Should we have done more? Absolutely. But we've met these things. They continue to be a real constraint on the making of policy in this country. And the Climate Change Act, so far at least, has lasted since its inception to today through some periods of pretty difficult politics. Let's just look at that path now. So this is just the same path, and I'll just draw on it now just some clarity what's in it. So we'll take the carbon budgets out of it. Our NDC, which we set at COP26 in Glasgow, was to reduce emissions by at least 68% by 2030. I remember having discussions at the time with unnamed officials, certainly they will not be named, who said, well, why can't it just be 70? Which, different age. But the reason it can't just be 70 is because we couldn't show you a path, at least without doing things that were beyond our advice, that would hit that without stepping quite a bit beyond what we saw as credible policies. And it might not sound a lot, but that 68 is really hard. So, that is our 2030 target. We were the hosts when it was set. It is still, I think, amongst the most ambitious NDCs that you'll find of any country. And then net zero is the 100% reduction that we need to achieve by 2050. Okay, this is the same chart, but this is our view. This is a couple of years old now, but this is a really important thing that we do whenever we do our advice on a carbon budget, is that we draw a baseline. So this is the baseline we drew at the last bit of advice. This is a world where we turn off climate policy. So that's what we would have expected to happen to emissions from 2020 onwards, and then that's the path beneath it. And then the really interesting thing is that we can then colour in, get our crayons out, the steps that are needed to take you from that baseline of no climate policy to the one that we think the country should try and hit. And the great thing in having a climate change committee is that this is not the first time that we've done this. So you get this, and it's a really useful thing to have some sort of independent body periodically asking the question, how do we do this? Other countries in the world do not have it. And it's tremendously useful, not just to government, it turns out. And this is the real, I think, advantage of the CCC and the Climate Change Act. It's also useful to people in industry, to people who are working on a host of other things, some of them nothing to do with climate change, because it gives you something that anchors the future. And something that is often said of me is that we do forecasting. Actually, we don't do forecasting. What we do is stand here and look back. It's hindcasting, really, to use that term, and that is very powerful. So I am duty-bound to say that the country has hit its targets in 2050, and what I'm asking, therefore, is not whether we hit them, it's how do we hit them, and each time we come to do it, we ask a question of what would we have done differently? What would we wish we'd done early to get more quickly onto that path? What are the things that may not be apparent now, but really are in 2050? And that is a very powerful technique, really. And I think, I encourage any of you who've got the chance to do it to do the same thing. Actually, it's a bit of Climate Change Act requires you to be a sort of futurologist, I suppose. It's very interesting to do it that way. But what this shows really clearly, and we'll do another one of these next year, is the very broad actions that deliver you net zero. So I've divided them into 4 here. The top one is about how we use energy, demand reduction. Much loved by academics, not much achieved in practice, so we could talk about that. Energy efficiency, resource efficiency is in there too. I think the thing to say about that is by 2050, it's not that big. It's not that much of the, it's not a huge part of the abatement. but in the early years it really is. And that's a clue that it's something you can do quickly, and therefore it's a way to save emissions quickly. Since we drew this, some of that has happened, but not nearly enough. So it's really interesting to say that. It's also the cheapest way to cut emissions usually. So it's a slight conundrum that we don't do more of it. But this is big politics playing out definitely in that wedge. I'll go to the third one because it will be easier to go to the second one after that. This is the story that gets the most attention is about low carbon energy production. And I'm as guilty as anyone else in thinking it's sexy and it's interesting. In this room, I'm sure there's people who work on it too. And there's a lot of that still to do. So we've got to build a lot of wind farms, we've got to build some nuclear, we've got to do hydrogen. There's a lot of stuff in there. But the wedge that you see there is mainly us cleaning up the electricity system. And that is still a remaining challenge. So we've got quite a lot of that to do. And of course, the last half of cleaning up the electricity system is the difficult bit because you've got to have a system that is reliable and operable. And as it moves to being more and more renewable based, doing that in a way that you can be confident of is harder and harder. Now, I'm very sure we can do it, but it's not so settled that we don't quite know exactly how we'll do that. So in that wedge is hiding a whole host of fascinating stories, but it's not the biggest story. That's partly why I went to it next. But let's imagine that at some point in the 2030s, we do reach a point where we have near as damn it cleaned up electricity production. That's a very important offer to the country because at that point we can switch to the second of these, which is about the switchover, and I think you should think of it that way, that the country's got to make to use that clean energy. Now, of course, we're in the middle of a switchover right now, but from the middle of the 2030s onwards, 2035 was our advice, we should have clean power. That's a huge offer to the country because what we're saying to you then at that point is anything that's electrical, you plug it in, it's zero carbon. And that is a really clear story that we don't have at the moment. And Jim and I were just talking about the latest apparent controversy about electric cars. A lot of that just goes away at that point. I think it's really important that we hit it. And Labour, of course, want to do it even earlier, which is a big ask, but it's a good thing to push for. So the biggest wedge here is electrification. This is us moving to especially electrified transport and electrified heat, electricity in industry as well. We use hydrogen. In this chart too, so you can see the red wedge there, that's us, and hydrogen, very, very controversial topic, particularly for home heating, but we need a lot of hydrogen. We're going to be using it extensively in the future energy system, and at the moment, hydrogen is a problem for climate change, so that hydrogen supply has got to be clean. We've got a bit of CO2 capture for those areas. At this stage, when we were doing this work, there's quite a few areas in industry, particularly where we couldn't see a way to not use fossil fuels, but we want to capture those emissions. As we come to do it again, I'm sure that wedge will get slightly smaller. It tends to do that over time, but there are really important applications for CCS that are in that yellow wedge. And if you do all of that, that's not zero. So the green bit there obviously is the offsetting bit of it, and that's mainly about what you're asking from nature. And this is another area where if I was hanging around, I'd be pushing more to do on this, the interaction between emissions reduction, adaptation, and nature and biodiversity. There's a lot going on in that green wedge there that we need to understand better so that we can be confident in asking what we need of nature. The other thing that's in there is engineered removals, another controversial topic. We, over the years, have advised that it's really important that we have greenhouse gas removals in the UK strategy. We've been more hand-wavy about what that is. So you broadly got two strategies. You can either use nature to mop up the carbon and then use it in an energy process and capture the carbon and bury it, or you can use machines to do it directly. I don't know what's going to win there, but I do know that if we're going to use biomass like that, we've got to be super clear that it's sustainable. So, this is another really important part of this story. But without it, we're going to really struggle. So it's really important to keep these options in play, I think. But this is the sort of rainbow chart, as I call it sometimes, that I find is really useful in communicating what the country's got to do to get to net zero. What happens to drive that is why it's so interesting to work on this stuff. So let's look again at that path and look at it in a different way. And this is the other way to look at that. So the other work that we do in the CCC is to look at where emissions start. So we look at the sectors, as we call them. You can see them on the right here. We don't just look at those sectors, but these are the sources of emissions. And what we're looking at here is how, in our work last time round for the sixth carbon budget, we determined each of those sectors could decarbonise. We actually had 5 scenarios looking at that. This is the sort of central scenario. The balance pathway, as we called it. And it's just a fascinating thing to do this work. So when we started back in 2008, it was very much driven top down. So we were looking, not entirely, but we were looking at, a lot of the energy system modelling involved in this. Now when we do it, and others do the same, it's very bottom up. So we're looking at strategies in each of these sectors to cut emissions and asking that question I mentioned earlier, how could we do this more easily, sort of looking back from 2050. And in each of those sectors, there is a different set of things happening. So this idea that you just put a carbon price on it and let the market decide, it just won't work that way. So we've got different stories playing out in surface transport, and some of it involves carbon pricing, of course, but there's a role of regulation playing out, there's incentives, there's things that we think can make some of this go quicker than in other sectors. And that's broadly how you see it there, and you can really see the importance of removals under the line there. It's more easy to see that way. The black bit is the engineered removals, the green bit is land use sinks. So that's what we're asking of nature. I think the other thing to say from this, it's not entirely clear in this, but when you hit this kind of point here, 2040, the energy story we should be close to getting done. So we should be getting close to the point where the energy-driven emissions, as the fossil fuel emissions, we're down to fumes. And that's not far away. So in terms of the infrastructure challenges that drive that, we're in it now. So this is going to be the point when we really decide whether this is ever going to be, this is going to happen or not on time. And I think the point I really want to draw out of this chart is not all of that actually, but crucially that mostly now what's constraining us to go faster is pretty practical stuff. So we're not doing what we would have done in 2008, which is imagining the strategies and wondering what they are. We're pretty clear now how you do it, and there's definitely options here, but the broad solutions are not the challenge. It's getting it done that's the challenge. So it's practical issues, and by that what I mean is how quickly do we replace those fossil fueled assets, the dirty assets, with the clean ones? Do we, for example, look at scrappage, something we've traditionally not looked at in the CCC, but actually in a world of really high fossil fuel prices, scrapping capital assets that use fossil fuels is not a bad idea. That might make that path go quicker. But more than that, do we have people in the right industries? Do we have the skills to do this stuff and install this stuff? Do we crucially have a planning regime that lets the infrastructure go to the places that it needs to go on time and in the right places? And will consumers wear it? And will people wear it? Consumers is probably the wrong term here. And I'm going to talk about the people bit of this at the end of this discussion, but of course that is absolutely critical to this. But maybe I'll say now that I don't think the people bit of it is as important as some of the politicians you might hear speak about think it is. I think it's actually the other stuff that matters more, certainly at the moment. It's about getting stuff done. Net zero is much more about building new things than it is stopping things. And building new things in a world where planning basically prevents it is going to be really tough. So that is the biggest constraint. Now, this could be a very short section. Are we on track? No, we're not on track. And it's very important to say that. Could we be on track? Yes. So I'm very happy to say that the options are still there before us. But it will take policy, and it will take a response from the private sector and from people in this country to deliver it. I'm very happy to say that if we do all of that, I'm pretty sure the outcome will be very positive. But back to my chart here, and just to draw on it again, the 2030 pledge. So this is probably the best way I know, at least, of assessing progress. So you can assess progress on future carbon budgets or the net zero, but 2030 is a number. And we've done some work just to look at what it would take to deliver the 68% reduction from where we are. And this is stuff we published just last year, so you may have seen it already, but it's very useful. So let's just do, what we have is emissions data from 2022. So let's look at the 2022 position, and let's imagine a situation where we can look at the progress we made 8 years prior to 2022, and then we know broadly what needs to be done in the 8 years after 2022 if we're going to hit the 2030 target. And that information comes from the government's plan. So this is what the government say they want to do. We in the CCC have our own view on that, but it's similar. So this is what we did in the 8 years prior to reduce emissions. This is the average emissions reduction per year in the 8 years prior to 2022. And it's a good story. It shows you where the priority has gone in policy terms. So it's the power sector. In other sectors, things are happening, but as you will see, not at the scale required for 2030. So if we want to hit where the government wants to be in 2030 to reduce emissions by 68%, in every sector other than the power sector, we've got to very dramatically increase the pace of progress to reduce emissions. Substantially increase the pace of progress. And some of this isn't, agriculture is quite an interesting one, because by 2030, we're not anticipating that much. So this isn't actually telling you the full story of agriculture. After 2030, we've got to do a hell of a lot to cut emissions, and you don't see that there, but we're not seeing that kind of progress. So that's the sectoral look. This is, I think, the more compelling way of looking at it. So we can go back to the whole economy. And we stripped out shipping and aviation because it's still doing funny stuff after the pandemic. But if you look at every other sector, again, 8 years back, 8 years forward, 8 years prior to 2022, we were cutting emissions by about 3% per year. And in the 8 years to come, that's got to double. So you've got to double the pace of decarbonisation over the next 8 years if you want to hit the 2030 goal. But as you know, that rests on the power sector. So if we take that out, I think you get the reality of where we are in terms of the policy programme. So in the 8 years prior to 2022, we were only cutting emissions by 1% per year. And if you want to hit 2030, that's got to quadruple. So the pace of progress has to quadruple. Now, the Prime Minister tells us that he's confident we'll hit that. And he said so in Downing Street back in September. I hope he's right, but I don't see, before the work we've done and others, I do not see a policy programme that has quadrupling power. And I think whatever government we have, and I'm not making predictions about the next election, this is what they'll have to tackle. Or they're going to have to say to the UN process, oh, I'm sorry about the target that we set, we didn't hit it. So that is a big challenge, I think, for our credibility on the world stage, but more importantly, for that path that I showed you before. Now, so far, so miserable. But I still think we'll do it. Maybe not 2030. We'll see. But net zero is definitely a thing that we can achieve. And why do I say that? Well, it's because of this. Now, in this room, I suspect many of you work on energy. But we are seeing astonishing things happen in the technologies that will drive that transition. And it's not just an energy transition. If you ask me, truthfully, what am I optimistic about is the energy stuff. What am I pessimistic about is land use and agriculture. But on energy, tremendous things are happening. So we are seeing, still to this day, exponential decreases in the cost of the key technologies. This is solar, and this is a log scale. So it's amazing what has been achieved in solar. It is absolutely astonishing. The red lines on this are the IEA's cost projections, and they're terribly wrong. So they're consistently wrong on this. And although we have seen a bit of a blip after the pandemic, this continues to this day to be the case. Now, this is some really interesting work, which I fully recommend if you go and find it, looking at not just the kind of story in the past, but sort of making some probabilistic forecasts if we see big deployment of these technologies, which is, I think, the way we should think of it. And this just shows you what that future for the price, levelized cost of energy could be in the future. So that's solar. And I sort of wish it wasn't a logarithmic scale, because you would just see the stunning fall. It's like 99% reduction, over the past 20 years or so. This is wind, not quite as dramatic, but still pretty dramatic. And of course, this is going to be a big story for the UK. Again, IEA getting it wrong again. I'm not blaming the IEA. This is batteries with the IEA being so far off, it's crazy. So, this kind of amazing stuff happening in batteries, which is then the story of transport. And just because we've got it, I've put electrolyzers on there too. So that's another interesting one. It's not quite the same data set, but you see some evidence of the same exponential stuff happening there too. Now, all of that is good, okay? I think that is why we should feel confident. The other interesting thing is that we can look at fossil fuels in the same way. And the really interesting thing with fossil fuels is that probably today, as I'm talking to you in kind of real terms, we pay the same price for fossil fuels today as we did 140 years ago. So we're just not seeing that same story playing out. And that is just a transition happening. You don't need to care about climate change to see that happening. And I'm super optimistic about that, therefore. The challenge is going to be partly about politics of this. We're going to end on that in a second. But actually, let's not dismiss the technical challenge of building energy systems that actually deliver this and can be relied upon, because it is more challenging. And the other challenge here is how you pay for it. So the economics of this are really clear. You pull something out of the ground, you burn it, and that's what the consumer is paying for. It's a commodity being burned. Well, renewables isn't like that. Nuclear isn't like that. And that requires, I think, policy to make it work. Now, if we have policy, we reveal a very cheap price to the consumer, because what the consumer is paying for is the capital cost of the thing that uses the free energy source. But policy has got to stick, and you need good policy over a long period to make that work. So, I'm super optimistic it can be really quick, but it still relies on enlightened policies to make that happen. And this stuff doesn't go away. So we rely on this today. And a very important point is, I think actually the language that was in the COP28 cover agreement is the right language. Transition away is better, I think, than phase out, because that is what we need to do. We've got to transition away in a way that is genuinely sustainable in all meanings of that word. But I think this is why we'll do it. So what's the hold-up? Well, there's lots of hold-ups here, but this is where we come to the story of politics. But I want to just say it's not just about politics. It's also about how we who work on this frame it. So I think my other reflection on this is that we use words like fundamental, and we use words like radical. And it is definitely the case, if you work on energy, that this is a fundamental shift in the energy system. So this is something actually I did recently, was just to look at what's in that same pathway. This is broadly what it says about energy demand. It's quite surprising, actually, that at the moment, roughly 2,000 terawatt hours of energy demand today, most of that obviously oil and gas. And by 2050, we're going to have energy demand. Now, how will we do that? I'm not some sort of magician here. We'll do that mainly because we're going to electrify the economy. We're going to use less energy to do the same stuff. So it's not magic. That's us not wasting energy in the form of heat, not wasting primary energy by burning stuff and losing most of it. And you see that there. So this is, again, our central pathway. The electricity system is double the size and then a bit more. And we've got a hydrogen sector that's in there too, that's about 2/3 the size, actually, of the electricity sector. We are still using oil and gas, but we're using it in a very different way, gas in particular. And I'm sure when we come back to it, we'll shrink that still further. But we've got to be confident about how we do that. Gas is very important, but increasingly we know how to do it without it. Oil's in there, but mainly just jet fuel. So that's the transition. Now, we present that often, I'm guilty of this as much as anyone else, as a fundamental change, big shift, and no doubt it is, but it's not a fundamental change to society. And a really important point, definitely what I've learned over 6 or 7 years doing this, is it needs to be normalized. The world in 2050 is basically the same world as we have today. It's not a big shift. So Corinne LaQuerie, who's on my committee, I remember she asked this question when we gave the advice on net zero: what kind of world is it in 2050 and how radically different is it? And it's not radically different. So you're still eating meat, we're still driving cars, we're warm in our houses, we just pay less for energy. I think we could do better at describing it in normal terms. This is a transition that is going to happen and you're going to like it. So this is a sort of thing that we need to talk more about. But no doubt, there's a hell of a lot to do. So the transition in buildings in particular, and industry for that matter, has hardly begun at all. And we need to be creative about how we present that. So let me just end on this. Now, levelling with the public is what the Prime Minister said he wanted to do. And here's a few different takes on that challenge. This is a bit of work that we did back in the 6th carbon budget that we didn't give as much attention to. That I sort of regret not doing more on this at the time. When we do the next carbon budget, we're going to throw a lot of time and resource at what we call the distributional impacts of this, because I think that's really exciting and really interesting. This is just one way of looking at the distributional impacts, and we had other ways in the 6th carbon budget report as well. When we have that technical work on the pathway that I've been showing you today, it allows us to do something really cool, which is to look at what's in that pathway and crucially make some broad assumptions about how much it might cost. So the challenge for the country is the investment challenge. We need to do lots of capital investment to hit net zero, more than we would be doing otherwise. And then we also get a saving in using all these particularly electrical assets that we bought, these technologies, cars and heat pumps. Now we can net that off. So the sort of CapEx cost, OpEx saving, that's the way to think about it. And what's interesting is that when you look at it over 30 years and net it all off, you get to a figure that's not far off zero. So the kind of net position of net zero in aggregate is zero cost on that basis. It's what we call the resource cost. Now, I've talked about that, others have talked about it too, and it's true. I think that is absolutely the case. And interestingly, as the cost of fossil fuels goes up, the relative cost of decarbonising goes down, basically. So probably if we did the same work today with the fossil fuel prices we have today, you'd get a net saving to the economy that was pretty significant over that 30-year period, 25-year period. But no one experiences the aggregate. So I think the really important thing is that your circumstances will matter immensely over this. This is one way of looking at this challenge, and we could do this, that sort of net cost, the resource cost. We're looking at here, the first bar in each of these sectors is that net position in 2035 in that pathway I've been showing you, CapEx minus OpEx saving, and then in 2050. So this is quite an interesting illustration of the challenge that the Prime Minister, I think, rightly has highlighted, that we do need to level with people, that it's not a free lunch. This is definitely not a free lunch, and particularly not over the next 10 years or so. We've got to do things that will cost the country money, and the question is, if you believe that we're going to hit those targets, the question is not to duck that entirely, but to ask a question about how we're going to do it. But it's quite interesting to look at this, and again, when we do this work again, almost certainly we'll see that the cost reduction in some of these sectors get even bigger. So you think of it in that way. But you can see very clearly here that for transport in particular, you've got this net saving going on. This is us moving particularly to an electrified transport system, also travelling a bit less with vehicles on the road. And that net saving grows into the future. But in other sectors, notably buildings, that's not the case. There is a payoff to putting heat pumps in buildings, but it's not immediate. And I think it is good to say that we should be levelling with people about that. Now, I like to think we have levelled with them, actually, but there are other ways to look at this, across income distributions, for example, or across geographies. But we should be quite happy to do so, because the benefit to this is enormous, not just to the climate, but to all the industries that will grow as we do these investments. And I think that story of green growth, which Chris Skidmore and others have really thrown a lot at and really highlighted, is completely legitimate. But we're not looking at that here. This is just the raw resource cost. And there are costs. And if you buy that argument of investing to save, that is the goal for net zero, then investing to save is a good thing to do for all sorts of reasons. But there is a short-term cost to that, particularly over the next decade or so. So the next Parliament and the one after it will have to grapple with that. And I don't want to stand before you tonight and say anything other than that. But it's totally worth it. And we haven't done lots of work to look at the dynamic benefits of investing at that scale, but this is a country that underinvests. This is a good reason to do this stuff, is to just invest more. And the industries that will grow are not in the southeast of England. They're right across the country, particularly the buildings transition. They're in places that need that investment. So there's all sorts of good reasons to do this, even if you don't care about the climate, and we should care about the climate. And that story of green jobs is really important. And I'll come on to how you might frame this in a second. But Jim asked me to speak about this, and I think I'd shown this, didn't I, Jim, when I spoke last time? I absolutely love this, right? So I think this is one of the more recent occasions when we as a country have tried to do something difficult. And this is a different age. So I don't know if anyone reads Country Life magazine. I bet you don't, but there is. Country Life magazine's been around for a while. In the 1960s, the CEGB, the Central Electricity Generation Board, the wholly state-owned entity that was doing all the investment in the power system at the time and planning the power system that we have now, was grappling with similar issues, actually. The story of putting infrastructure in difficult places was what they were looking at. They were upgrading the power system to 400 kV. And I love this, and if you're interested, I'll show you the whole advert afterwards. But what I love about it is they had a series of full-page adverts in the places that would be affected by this infrastructure, and they fully acknowledged that it's not that easy to do this. This is my favourite one. So where would you run the pylons? And it's quite an interesting thing to do, because they framed it up in a really clever way. They said, look, this is going to be a tricky thing for the country, but it's completely worth it. And they spelled out the benefits as well as the disbenefits to this, and acknowledged that not everyone's going to be happy with this. And I think often the planning issues are going to be like that. And there are lots of these types of challenges. And I think the challenge for politics is that we're not going to do this well unless we have politicians that are able to be similarly honest and upfront about this. And it's not just going to be the Climate Change Committee that needs to do that. We need to have brave politicians that present the benefits and the rough edges to it. And we need to do the same in power lines. This is a grid question. We've got to do huge things right across the country, all of which are worth it on all sorts of bases, but many of which are going to be tricky. And facing down some of the critics is definitely going to be one of the big challenges for politics. And at the moment, I worry that we don't have that type of politics. So we have lots of people who are willing to talk about net zero as a slogan, or how green they are, and you have lots of people who are willing to say the opposite too. But in reality, we need to be serious about the actual things that need to be done, and put around that proper messages to people living in this country and businesses operating in this country. My final point on this general issue is the other political challenge, I think, definitely something I've picked up in recent years, is that we get too distracted by minor issues. So we have debate about things like what Rowan Atkinson said about electric cars, rather than actually the big challenges that sit before us. This is one of those. So I'm going to end on this, but and I probably won't say too much about it, but we've had a huge debate on oil and gas licenses in this country for 2 years now, and that has been a conscious political decision from political leaders and in the opposition to have that debate. That's been the framing of it. I mentioned earlier that we need gas in that transition. So gas is definitely the challenge for us in this country, because you can see here, this is hard-fought data that was sitting in the North Sea Transition Authority, but they weren't that keen to publish it, but they now have published it. This is their view, and remember, their job is to try and maximise this stuff. So this is their view of the amount of natural gas, fossil gas, that will be produced in the North Sea over the next 20 years or so. And that is a 97% reduction in gas production. This is the production from development of undeveloped discoveries, basically the ones that we know about. And that is the licensing debate that we've been having for the last 2 years. So it's that red wedge that we're still having a fight about right now with a bill in Parliament. And it doesn't matter. Now, I know there's a bigger challenge here on what we're doing globally on this stuff, and I'm the first to acknowledge that that's a challenge. But this is what sucked all of the political capital out of the discussion about heat pumps. It's what's prompted. This is why we're not having a debate about what to do about farming. And if we keep doing this, we're going to be gummed up in the wrong stuff. I'm not saying this isn't important. What I am saying, though, is that that's a 95% reduction rather than 97% reduction. So we're having a debate about 2 percentage points, rather than the fact that the biggest story on that chart for me is that it's either 95 or it's 97, and that is a massive shift for an industry that employs lots of people in the northeast of Scotland particularly. So we're not having that debate either. And I just worry really that that's what we've got to tackle now. We've got to move into a different sort of politics where we get real about this for all sorts of reasons. I've been saying recently that the successful recipe, I think, to make all this stick is actually probably to put climate second as a priority for doing all of this. It's green jobs or jobs, I hate green jobs, but jobs, and it helps the climate. It's about investing in regions of the UK that need the investment, and it helps the climate. It's about landscape beauty, and it helps the climate. It's about national security, and it helps the climate. And my experience is that when you put it second, often the people who care about the first thing like it even more as a solution, even if climate isn't the thing that wakes them up in the middle of the night. So don't be distracted would be my main message to whoever takes over after the next general election. And the last thing I'll say is, if you're interested in any of this, and God, there's an even longer version of this if you're interested, we've got so much material on the CCC website, but I'll stop there, Jim. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That was truly fantastic, talking about the problem, a mix of pessimism and optimism,
yeah.
Some real geeky stuff, and then some high politics as well. And I've also worked quite a bit on your green graph, and I agree it's an entirely distraction. But,
yeah.
We need to show that graph more often, certainly, amongst many of the other things. And I endorse what you just said at the end about the website. It's a mine of information and analysis. So we've got quite a bit of time, 20 minutes or so for questions. I'll take them in 2s or 3s. If you just say who you are when you ask a question, please ask a question, please keep it brief. Those are the rules. So you first.
Great, thanks Chris. So Ed Gemmell, I'm the leader of the Climate Party nationally. So I'd quite like just to ask about the way we're framing it and then get your take on it actually. So I'm not discussing currently the targets because our target's 2030 decarbonisation for particular reasons. And the framing is, look, there's a hell of a lot of money to be made, and it's not just the jobs. Prosperity for British people in the 2030s and 40s, if we beat everybody else to get there, at the moment we're not. And it's all about the fact that we need money for our NHS, our police, and everything else, and we don't have it because we've got this general spiral down in terms of our manufacturing capacity, reducing down the percentage of our GDP coming from it. So the whole framing is upside. It's all about money in the pocket tomorrow, and it's all about we won't have enough money for the NHS and the police unless we invest. And if we invest and move really early, which is coming to 2030, and bring it before all the other countries, we can lead that clean industrial revolution. There's not a mention of green, there's no mention of savings, it's all about profit.
Thank you.
Well,
Shall I take a couple more?
yeah,
Is that all right?
I mean, I'm not sure that was a question.
I guess you were asking for a
Yeah.
reflection on it.
Great.
I was going to go to this side, just at the back there, for the second one, and then I'll come to you. Please?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, I'm Abdullah. I work on carbon footprint measurement. My question is, basically, we see great progress with on the graphs, really lovely what the UK has done. But the question is, how much of that is outsourced emissions? So, for example, with charcoal, there's a lot of regulations about sustainable charcoal in the UK, but then you can just import unsustainable charcoal very easily. And so we're all in the same planet. So is there any value in the UK having its emissions reduced, but globally, maybe in some other countries, it's increased?
Great, I can cover that.
And the third question just here.
Hi, Catherine Hayes. I work for the Energy Security and Net Zero Committee at the House of Commons. So we're in an election year. What could the government reasonably get done before the election to get us a bit further forward on net zero?
Great.
So nice question.
Yeah, they're great
questions.
So, I mean, I made the point several times. I was talking about territorial emissions, but you're absolutely right. We're responsible for more than that. I think the first thing to say is it's still the biggest bit. So, in terms of our footprint globally, it's what we produce here within our territory that is still the most important bit of that. But you could probably add another half again onto those emission stats to look at what we call consumption emissions. They're also falling though, so I think it's important to say, and I don't want to dismiss it, but I think if the world goes on the journey that I showed you right at the top of my presentation, then our consumption emissions will be much less clearly by the time we get to 2050. But it's really important that we take a rounded view to it. So I'm slightly constrained by the remit that we have, which is the remit that the UN requires of the UK to look at production emissions. But we do take a rounded view in the work that we do. And in particular, the advice that we give to government about this is not just about reducing domestic emissions, it's also about reducing the overall footprint. And the other thing to say on this is that I think the other big story that's been playing out and continues to play out in the time I've done this job is now this question of actually drawing borders around territories and actually applying a tariff if you've got a high carbon production happening somewhere else. And that is, you saw that actually in the UK very recently when it was apparent that we've decoupled the ETS in the UK from the EU, and it was suddenly apparent that our ETS price was much lower than the EU's price, and clever people said, well, hang on a minute, if we export stuff into an EU that has a CBAM around it, a carbon border around it, we'll just be paying the EU monies that otherwise would go to the UK exchequer. And it was a kind of really realistic appraisal, I think, for the first time, that we need these carbon borders around products so that we have a level playing field for producers here in the UK for those products. And the one area where we don't do any of this really is food, and it's hugely problematic. I think if you're a Welsh sheep farmer, that you can get, well, sheep's probably not a great example, but a beef farmer, let's say in Northern Ireland, you can be blown out the water by cheap imports of beef produced in other parts of the world with really low standards of environmental protection and lots of carbon emissions or methane emissions associated with them. So I think this is going to be a continued theme, but I did want to make the point that we do absolutely look at it, and as do my colleagues in government. I think we do have a pretty well-rounded view of it, I think, in the UK. Other countries perhaps not. What should the government do before the election? I don't know, because I don't know when the election is going to be. But get a bloody move on would be the first thing. I think the more useful, perhaps, thing to say is, well, two things. Stop flip-flopping on policies. It's so destructive to do it. We've been through quite an interesting and very weird period since the Prime Minister made the speech in Downing Street. And incidentally, if you read his speech, I'd recommend reading it, actually. It's a good speech. It says a lot of stuff that I agree with. But it was spun and presented as a sort of retreat from net zero. And I think the first thing to say on that is when I went to COP this year, it was pretty embarrassing actually. So we had lots of people saying, "What are you guys doing?" And it's hard to answer that question. But in reality, what we actually did, we're doing loads of climate policy. So what we've seen since the climate speech that the Prime Minister made is more climate policy than we were seeing prior to it. But weirdly, the Prime Minister doesn't want to own it. It's a strange thing. So, and Chris Skidmore calls it green hushing. I think it's quite a good term, actually. So let's do it, but let's not talk about it. So, that sort of messaging matters. So I would firm up the messaging and stick to your guns would be my first thing to say, perhaps. But then the other story on flip-flopping is there has been some genuine flip-flopping. And it's very, very destructive because it destroys the confidence of supply chains and suppliers, especially. And we've seen that in the past with energy efficiency, where we had, in the austerity years, the government pull the rug from a lot of the support schemes on home insulation particularly. And we've never recovered from that because understandably the supply chains, the people that would do the installations were really burned by it. And I worry that we've just done that again with electric vehicles, even though we stuck with a zero emission vehicle mandate, which is actually the one that really matters in terms of emissions, a very important policy. The message that we gave to the consumer is don't buy an electric car. So you create this kind of really weird situation where we're telling the manufacturers of vehicles to produce them, but we're telling the consumers not to buy them yet. So that's going to be an interesting one to watch. And we may be doing, I don't know, but we may be doing the same with boilers and heat pumps. And whether we are or not, that's the discussion now. And we don't have, and it's notable, a set of politicians are out saying, no, actually, we're going to stick to this and we're going to do it because it's the right thing. So I think the more that we can land certain messages and be clear about the future, the more we'll get some economic benefit from this and the less damaging it will be. Politics is politics. I'm not a politician, but that would be my top thing. And then maybe the other thing, and I'm sure the civil service is doing this, is, and this is the dark secret, is there's not that much difference between the Conservatives and Labour on this stuff. Maybe there will be. But broadly, the stuff that I referred to earlier is what each party wants to do. They just might want to do it in a slightly different way, but even that's not much difference. So as a civil servant, if you're preparing for the potential change of government, there's lots of ways in which you can get going on things that the next government will want to do, and I very much hope my colleagues are doing that. So that power target, for example, decarbonising power, whether it's 2035 or 2030, Labour want 2030, the Tories say 2035. Doesn't really matter. You've got to do the same stuff. So that's a very sensible, safe territory to really push accelerated action. And I hope that's what they're doing at the moment in government. That's definitely my advice.
Thank you. I'm going to go over here. I was seeing a lot more hands than I saw. There's somebody. I'm going to take you right at the back, next to the person in green. Yes, you.
Hi, I'm Dipsy Abiola. I work in innovation and I'm particularly interested in decarbonisation of aviation. So you mentioned a lot of really interesting things in your talk. I'd love to hear you talk about how finance and investment can be incentivised, specifically in this country, but just more generally, because a lot of innovation is happening, there's a lot that's going on in universities, especially in startups, but it would be great to talk about the ways in which the financial sector can do.
Great, thank you. Just on the front here.
Yeah, I'm Paul Eakins, and I'm at UCL Institute of Sustainable Resources. Thanks, Chris. I really enjoyed that. Twice during your presentation, you mentioned high fossil fuel prices. Now, my perception is that as the demand for fossil fuels is cut, if it's cut globally, is that we won't be looking at high fossil fuel prices, and they could actually reduce very fast indeed. So my two questions are, what will that do to the climate trajectory when suddenly renewables are not so much cheaper than fossil fuels? And secondly, and this is a bit outside your Climate Change Committee remit, what does that do to the macroeconomy when so much value in oil and gas companies is destroyed and their share price falls off a cliff? Because that is something which is going to hit us hard if we're not in some way prepared for it.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay, so do those two, or do you want to do another one? As long as you can remember them, I forget more than two. So.
Well, yeah, okay. Well, why don't you do those, and then I'll come back to other people. Yeah, because you've got two
I
in
could
one
spend
there.
2 hours talking about that stuff, but I can't remember more than two questions. The question of finance, let's just deal with that, and then Paul's question, which he cheekily had two questions. So on finance, this is another part of the story that's become much more interesting, I think, over the last few years. because we used to think that everything had to be done with public policy and it had to be done mainly with public spending. I think that was we didn't say that, but I think a lot of the discussion of this was about how much to spend on it. And what's been really reassuring actually is the degree to which I think we should rely on straight up private sector, privately financed investment to drive this. But definitely one of the best things I've done in this job is some work that we did alongside this, the thing I've shown you, which is to look at the conditions for that. And it stands up today. A good colleague of the CCC, Nick Robbins, who's at LSE, he led the work on it. What he looked at, I'll be honest with you, which is the reason we asked Nick to do this, because as we were doing this work, we were getting the investment numbers and they're big, right? So, I mean, we're talking about an extra 50, 60 billion of capex per year as a whole economy. And that's quite a lot, actually, although I think there's a big saving that goes with it. If you roll that up, you're into, as the Daily Telegraph quite regularly tell me, north of $1 trillion. Again, it's not a cost, but it's still a big number. And what we were asking Nick to look at was, firstly, is that credible, was what we asked the team of financiers that he brought together. And they said, absolutely. It's about adding an eighth to the total capex the country does. So that's well within fluctuations seen before. But only if the policies permit it. And that's the really interesting thing about it. So what we need to, I think, continue to work on is what are the policies that help shape private investment to deliver this stuff well and cheaply. And the other thing that goes with the cost story is that the interest rate on that, or the cost of capital, is a big determinant of how expensive or otherwise this is. And in turn, one of the ways in which the cost of capital is driven is uncertainty, and that's about policy flip-flopping, back to my story earlier. So there's other things going on there too. So you want to minimize that uncertainty as much as possible. So I think mostly my view is that in those sectors, you can't just have one size fits all. So the formula for a good policy to drive private finance into the transport transition, for example, is different to the one in power sector, or particularly the one in the building sector. So we should look at it broadly around those sectors and ask questions about how to shape that with policies that are not just about spending money. Often public spending is a bad way actually to drive private finance. So you can do a bit of crowding in with it, but it's not that successful in doing the job that markets do very well, cutting the price of those things. So regulation is often another way into it. Setting good standards is another. But I mean, I think, again, a much longer presentation could look at what's in those things, but that's, I think, a really interesting question. It's not so difficult to achieve if you view it that way, actually, as well. So it's not just about how much public spending the Treasury permits in that world. And for me, that's one of the most exciting things of all of this, which is that I think we can frame this up really well with good, strong policies, like the CFD in renewables, that really deliver. And that's a very well-considered piece of policy, but we could do that in other areas too. And the CFD is not the model in some sectors, so we need different models. And keep working on it, because it's fascinating. I think it's my top tip. Now, Paul, first question was what?
First question is,
I told you
if the price goes down,
oh, yeah.
the price goes down, you've got two things. Firstly, the competition with
Yeah.
renewables. Secondly, macroeconomic effects.
So I tend to agree with what you've said, although other explanations are available. So, I mean, I think that it's a fool's errand to predict what happens with fossil fuel prices. But in the long run, I think you're probably right, that it's likely they'll go down rather than up, although I keep being proved wrong on that. I think the important thing for people like me is to make sure that the work that we're doing is resilient to that. So we're looking at one of the biggest, not mistakes, because I don't think we could have predicted, but one of my regrets about the work that we did here is we had too narrow a range for the underlying fossil fuel price. And what we had was, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which blew that out of the water. And actually we will do this in the next piece of work, is look at a much broader range, high and low. And I'm fairly confident, because we've already started to do the numbers on it, that this still stacks up, is the kind of first thing to say on that. The second part of your question is the more interesting one, I think, actually. Well, what's the broader impact, particularly globally, as that happens? Because you do see destruction of value to shareholders, and those shareholders often are states, so the sovereign states. And that, for me, is why the COP process is so important, actually, is that we've got, although I would love to see text that had much more radical language in it, that we've got to keep working at this, because those parts of the world that rely on oil and gas as the basis of their economy, there's lots of them. And this is people in jobs we're talking about. This is not some dictator that we're talking about, it's actual people in jobs. There has to be some future for those economies that beyond oil and gas. Some of them will continue to produce oil and gas, but they can't do so with emissions. And we haven't really framed it in that way, I think. And I think I don't have a good answer to your question because I think that there's a big risk of big disruption with lots of uncertainty and lots of risk, which manifests often in very nasty ways. And we're sort of covering our eyes and pretending that's not going to happen. But as you go down the other side of that emissions chart I showed you globally, that's when it starts to happen. There's already a few signs of that, I think. So the unrest there will be in the fossil fuel economy is enormous, actually, potentially. And if you can harness that unrest to move more quickly in the green stuff, that would be good. But we've got collectively difficulty in talking about that at the moment. I worry about it too, Paul. And maybe you've got an answer, but I'm not sure I have.
Okay. Here at the front, and then there's one here, please.
Hi, thanks again for the presentation, Chris. Ajay Lawali, Head of Supply Chain at Renewable UK and Electrical Engineer. I'm going to be a little plug, I'm sorry.
Short one.
There was a previous comment from a colleague about the opportunity in the economy. And one of the recent papers that myself and colleagues have produced is supply chain analysis of offshore wind. Offshore wind will become the main form of electricity generation within the UK's energy system in the next 20 to 30 years. I just encourage anyone who's interested in that economic story and the opportunities in the UK economy, and particularly the point around green skills and jobs, to have a look at it if you're interested. I think, Chris, one of the things that you touched on is the messaging point for me, and how it's, we're in danger of seeing net zero as a threat to the economy and indeed what current jobs we have from fossil fuel oil. How do you think we can improve the messaging around the opportunity for green skills and jobs, given that we literally have thousands of people now working in the renewable energy sector?
Great question. And then just one here, please.
Hi, Chris. My question is, well, my interest is in supply chains. And for me, supply chains is always 3,000 miles away, somewhere in India or Africa. When I was at Scope 3 talks this morning at another conference, they were saying that people have barely fathomed what Scope 1 and 2 is.
Yeah.
So I said, what about Scope 3? And they says, oh yeah, from the raw material. I says, no, not from the raw material. From the forests that we are deforesting and strip mining in India and Africa, not for the fossil fuels for running the diesel car, but for the fossil fuels that we need in umpteen amounts to get the lithium and the cobalt out of Congo and all across Africa. So my question is there's this delusion that's still being pushed that firstly renewables are fossil fuel free. No, they're not. Secondly, that it's all clean and green. Well, to get all these minerals, you need to trash. I mean, you need to do a second invasion of Africa. Basically finish the job that was never finished 100 years ago, because most of the resources are coming from Congo and India and South America. We are losing huge amounts of forest. So if the supply chain, or Scope 3, or even Scope 4, whatever you call it, was to include from us strip mining our forests and our water systems to the raw materials, would this net zero really be justifiable when those mines are laden with hundreds of thousands of women and children? Is that justifiable so we can supposedly go green?
Thank you. Okay.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. As long as we do it well. So I don't want to have a fight with you about it, so let's not do that tonight. But the key thing is we don't have to choose that future. But there's a huge amount of disruption that comes from bringing fossil fuels out of the ground as well. There's been quite a lot of good work done on the size of that versus the size of, absolutely. So I'm confident it can be done well. The question is, can we make it happen that way? And not everything comes from the Congo. And it does, but you could. I mean, there's already vehicles in the market that don't use any cobalt from the Congo. So the point is that's a soluble problem, and it's a much smaller one than the fossil fuel problem. You can disagree, but that's definitely my view.
Could you let Chris answer the question?
So I think the challenge is a good one, though. I mean, the job I'm off to is the issue that you're raising is the reason I want to go and do this job, because I think the broader question is the right one. That we've got to think about this not in narrow. I don't think that was narrow, but we shouldn't be narrow. And Scope 3 is the right way to think about it. We know very little about Scope 3, and to me, that's the challenge. So making that work well is where I think we will make this thing stick. And I absolutely think that the green economy, whatever you want to call it in the future, is a better place to be in all sorts of ways. And the mining question is one that lots of people looked at, including notably the IEA last year, And what they would say is, yeah, there is indeed a lot of mining that's required for the minerals for net zero, but it doesn't need to be disruptive, and it's a tiny fraction of what we'd be doing if we were bringing fossil fuels out of the ground at the same scale we do today. So, I mean, I think it's worth it, basically, is my answer to your question. And there's a link, I suppose, to the other point about how we sell this to I don't know if you need to sell it, actually, but I think to describe it, perhaps, in a way that looks more appealing. And I think I don't have all the answers for that because I'm not a salesman, but I think one thing I'll say is that we have consistently overinflated the benefit in jobs terms from renewables. I was once in the Scottish Government, and we used to talk a lot about all the jobs in Dundee. I'll tell you what, there's no one in Dundee working in renewables right now. I mean, there might be some actually, but they're not the 30,000 people that was promised by Alex Salmond. I don't know where you put 30,000 new people to work in renewables in Dundee. But I think getting rid of what these jobs are is my first thing to say on it. And maybe the second thing to say is I said this earlier, I hate the term green jobs. I just don't like it. And I won't say who it is, but one of the big energy companies in Scotland did a little experiment on this very issue. I was told, and I happen to believe it, but basically a set of jobs that they were advertising that they described as green, and a set of the same jobs that they didn't put the green word in, and interestingly they had twice as many applicants for the second advert. And I think it tells you something about, I mean, they were engineering jobs, but it tells you something about some of this is actually, it puts people off, actually. So I think the more we normalise this, the better. But absolutely, let's talk about the massive win that there is with these industries. The point I really wanted to make when you asked the question is, I think, a more fundamental one. The oddity of this is that I can show you charts like that, and it can show you that there is a huge set of new industries that we don't have at the moment, or at least that we don't have at that scale in 2050. But we are sure of that, but we don't know what next year looks like. So you get this kind of really interesting conundrum. If you just stick with offshore wind, for example, we've got a really good policy mechanism for developing offshore wind in the CFD, but it's an annual auction. And if you want to get the wider benefit to that CFD is actually not very good at landing a lot of the production that you want to see here, because you can't be sure how you get from here to there. So I think there's quite an interesting question about, I think the CFD is a brilliant policy and we shouldn't lose it, but there's another question about is there more that we can do to guarantee what that transition might look like, given that it's squillions in 2050. What could we do to give greater certainty that there will be some sort of production for things like cabling, for example, those sorts of things? And I think that is an interesting policy question. And Labour said more about that perhaps than the Conservative Party have. But both parties, I think, have got a challenge to describe how you bridge that gap, which is more than just a CFD, perhaps.
Right, thank you. I'm going to squeeze in two more questions, so apologies to those who are going to be disappointed. I've got one there, and I'll take one randomly. I'll take you over here. Sorry to those who I can't read. Please.
Thank you. I'm Dan. I'm here at the Centre for Biodiversity and Environment Research at UCL. In my experience talking with people, colleagues about getting to net zero climate change, there seem to be sort of two fronts. Sort of an answer you often get is people kind of blaming the big industry, saying, okay, well, yeah, most of the emissions are due to the top 100 companies, mostly oil and gas companies. But and then you've got the other front with people saying, oh, it's our own personal responsibility of consumers. We need to change our consumption behavior, eat less meat, buy less, all the rest of it. Which, is a very fair point. I'm just wondering what your take on that is. What is the true story there? Obviously, neither side is carrying the whole truth in that debate. And I've got my own thoughts on that, but I was just wondering.
Sure, thank you. Okay, and we'll just do one more, just in front of the camera there.
Hi, I'm Louisa and I work for the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. And one of the kind of roadblocks we're facing with the UK is that the regulatory framework is actually in place. The CCC is gold standard in climate legislation, and got the FCA's sustainability disclosure requirements and the green finance strategy. But where the UK is really lacking is on that kind of implementation and delivery of climate policies. And I mean, even we represent investors, and these investors are calling out for those kind of long-term policy signals from government. But an issue we're facing is, like, how do you engage with a government that sees energy security and fossil fuel expansion as like two sides of the same coin?
So these are brilliant questions to end on, I think, actually. I mean, I'll maybe deal with that one first if I can, and I'll come back to them, because I think what your question is a totally fundamental one. I'm not sure there's an easy answer to it, but I've definitely got thoughts on it. So this question of how you build certainty of the delivery, I mean, it's the biggest frustration in my job. People say to me quite often, you must be very frustrated in your job. I'm not frustrated in my job. It's a great job to have, because I'm constantly hopeful that things will, be delivered. But I'm not that sure how. So, I mean, I think there's more and more, the delivery question is the one I'm most interested in. Again, part of the reason for doing the job I'm moving into is because I think I can probably do more on that front on the other side. But I understand basically what you've said, and I think one thing to point to, I'm glad that you think that it's gold standard that we have a CCC. I mean, I tend to agree, but the bit that's missing is that the kind of plans that follow the institutional framework and the legal framework that aren't always as good as they could be. And the missing bit is actually about deployment and delivery. It's like, we used to spend a lot of time looking for policies that weren't there, but now mostly we have policies in place. We are doubtful they'll be successful. So I think that's the next frontier, is can we have better certainty over, the policies are there, but can we have better clarity about how they'll be delivered? And I think the crucial point on this, I think, and to build investor confidence, if government wishes to pull a policy, as it's entirely legitimate for them to do so, on electric vehicles, for example, I definitely feel that one thing is missing is that there is not then a responsibility in the government to say what they're going to do instead. And I think that my answer often when journalists ask me questions about policy X being pulled or policy X being cancelled is, well, that's fine, it's legitimate for that to happen, but what's next? And I think, the boiler thing, for example, is another one of the examples. Like, there's a sort of free pass to pulling policies without saying what you're going to do next, and that's what investors see. They shrug and walk away. And I think the bit of institutional framework that's not there actually is that government, and particularly bits of government like the Treasury, need to be better at facing the consequences of the decision and being transparent about what the replacement strategy is. So I think if you were to push me on it, the work we'll do in the CCC after I go is going to be much more driven by the need for contingency. So as we get down the emissions curve, you get to lower levels, you've got to be more and more certain that you've got not just one strategy, but lots of strategies. And I think then the question is, if you're not going to follow one of those strategies, what are you going to do instead? And we should be able to provide some of that information. And I think there's a collective push to generally being better at fronting up on that. So I think we can do that, but we haven't got that in place yet. Interestingly, the EAC in the House of Commons also kind of alighted on this issue, that when it comes to doing the next carbon budget, the process is that we offer our advice on what that should be, and then government gets to think about it and legislate it, hopefully. What they're saying is when the government decides what to do about our advice, they should also be ready with a delivery plan. And I think that's totally legitimate. So we'll have a sense of what should be in that, but I think that's a really good addition to the process if we do that. And that, interestingly, is what Rishi Sunak said as well, and I firmly agree with it on Downing Street. On this question about consumption versus supply, or heavy industry, of course there isn't a right answer to this, but my view on it is that those of us who work on green issues often fall into the trap of presenting it in such a way that it looks like you have to stop doing lots of stuff to get to net zero, and that is then therefore a red flag to people who are very suspicious about this stuff. And I don't really make any judgment about that. One of the big dangers in my job is to imagine that the world's full of goodies and baddies. And that's just not the case. People are doing stuff mostly for the right reasons. They've just got might have a different outlook on it. And I think, again, first thing to say on it is that we've got to keep understanding people's views on this, including those who don't want to stop doing things that they enjoy and rely on in their life. And that is totally just legitimate outlook. But what I will say is, going back to this, is that there is indeed a bit of trimming of consumption involved in this. That was the purple stripes, if you remember, that I showed you, and just in the UK transition. But I think the most telling thing about that is it doesn't do that much. So, telling people to stop stuff is not a very successful strategy if you want to cut emissions quickly, or cut emissions deeply, actually, that's a better way to put it. So in the end, it is about a more fundamental set of investments in systemic things that deliver you long-term emissions reduction, and that tends to be upstream or with big policy and with big response from multiple consumers. And I think, maybe this will be my final point, I think it's good that I think we should be better at framing net zero as a sort of build it agenda rather than as a stop it agenda. And the more that we do that, the more that we'll have a positive discussion about it. And my very final point, I've been saying this a bit recently, and I'll stand by it. I also think given what I said at the end about being distracted by it. It is difficult to do this. People like me for a long time have been talking about how difficult it is and things like, for example, the heat transition. But it's also quite exciting to do it. And I think we should try and inject some of that back into it. And what I've been saying recently is that the Victorians had a lot to answer for, but they wouldn't have blinked at this, actually. They would just go on with it. And I think being a bit more Victorian in it would be the way to do it. So I'm going to end on that.
Fantastic.